On today's episode of the JB Podcast, we're going to get into what I think is a home run hire for the Johnnies. Let's get into it. So I know it's a few days later, but I was really excited on Monday. I had seen it coming for a while. I actually first saw reports or, hearing that this was possible probably early February. But the new head coach for the St. John's Red Storm is Rick Pitino. Now, for those of you who don't know, which most of you probably don't, I went to St. John's University. I'm a graduate of there. I went there because basketball is a huge passion of mine. I love basketball, and it just seemed like that whole school loved basketball and their basketball team because it's pretty much all they have there in regards to sports that really, really matter there. And, other people may disagree with that, but in 1985, the Chris Mullin, Lou Carnesecca, St. John's teams. Mark Jackson also went there, right? And Malik Sealy a few years later, and there's just a passion for St. John's basketball when you're on campus. But that passion has kind of been lost for a long time now because they haven't really been good. And specifically in the last 20 years, with a tournament appearance sprinkling every once in a while, they made, I say that in bunny ears. They made the tournament in 2019. That team was Shimori Pons, Mustafa Heron. It was Chris Mullins last year. They were a play-in team. They lost to Arizona State, coached by Bobby Hurley Jr., which, you could say they made the tournament, but it's also like, did they? So they didn't dance for too long, let's just say. So that's my personal connections to St. John's basketball. So I obviously been to the games in the last few years, and it's really fun when your school is good. Too bad, unfortunately, I'm graduated, but St. John's fans and students are gonna have a lot to root for, and I mean a lot. For those of you who maybe aren't familiar with, because there are some people out there on campus that aren't, they just see it as they don't follow basketball that much, and they see like, oh, they got a new coach, yay. Well, this is a Hall of Fame coach, one of the greatest coaches of all time. So St. John's is going to be in the tournament, under his tenure for sure. But let's talk about the significance of the hire, right? So St. John's new president, Father Shanley, who knows Pitino, he was at Providence. He tried to hire him back, I believe, in 2011. I think it was around then. So obviously, once it became clear Mike Anderson his time had run its course, it just seemed like Rick Pitino was the guy they were going for. I mean, he grew up in Oyster Bay, right? He's a New York guy. He's coached the Knicks. He's been a part of the Big East before, right, with Providence and Louisville for a bit. And, he's just familiar with this area. And because of his age, because of the situation that he put himself in, it just made the most sense in the world. All disrespect, no disrespect to Iona, who every once in a while they're really interesting and they're in the tournament. It just seemed bigger that he go to St. John's, right? And credit to Iona for basically hiring him, giving him another chance. But as we know what Pitino does, he says things, and then he does another. He's full of it at times, and he's a giant hypocrite. But he's a really good coach. And if we're being honest here, a ton of these college basketball coaches, they have something wrong in their past. There's always something shady, and it's really just been what college basketball has been for decades. All these coaches got some sort of dirt on them, whether they hide it well and they don't like to admit it. So you hear, for example, Rick Pitino when he was at Louisville, says things like, "Oh, I know everything, I know everything," and then when the shit hits the fan, he knows nothing. So we're gonna get into the scandals later, but it's important to bring them up because there's a reason why Rick Pitino is the St. John's coach. There's a reason why St. John's had the opportunity to even get a guy like him as their head coach. It's because of the scandals that Pitino has been under. Basically, most of his coaching career, there's always been something, especially in the 2000s. The significance of the hire for St. John's is with Chris Mullin, with Mike Anderson, Steve Lavin. They had moments. They had moments where you're like, okay, maybe, and maybe this is the year, right? But it didn't work out. You bring in Rick Pitino, he's going to bring you to the tournament. St. John's has basically told their fan base for 20 years that they didn't really care that much about the basketball team, which is crazy because it could be such a big moneymaker for them, and they just failed to see it that way. Now comes in Rick Pitino. Now you're hearing about games. Rick Pitino wants to play all the home games at Madison Square Garden, which I know some St. John's fans are not happy with because they like Lou Carnesecca Arena. They like how a lot of Long Island, Queens kids can just kind of drive 20, 30 minutes to St. John's campus and watch a game. But Madison Square Garden is the biggest stage here. If St. John's is playing most of their home games, which I expect they will have more home games at MSG next year, it's only going to put them on the map even more. There's going to be more significance. There's going to be more cachet to the school if they do that. Now, it's going to take, you got to pay in order to get these benefits, right? Rick Pitino, his name is great, and they're obviously going to pay him a big contract to have him coach this team. But it's important to understand that St. John's can really benefit from having this guy come in, playing those games at Madison Square Garden, getting that school's name out. It's a home run hire. And while maybe some people were okay with them not being that relevant, maybe being quiet, like with Mike Anderson, there was the whole Chris Mullin thing where you're bringing an old school, basically the face of St. John's basketball. Oh, wait, he has to actually coach the team. And that's a problem because Chris Mullin was not willing to do some of the things that a college coach is supposed to do. We're going to get into the issues with those teams, but let's talk about specifically when I was there. Chris Mullin's last year was my freshman year at St. John's. Mike Anderson came the year after. So I believe Chris Mullin was hired in 2015. So that's 15, 16, 17, 18. So about, I believe it was about 3-4 years, probably 4 years. Chris Mullin was there. I started watching St. John's ball my freshman year mainly, and watching Chris Mullin coach that team was very difficult. It was just clear he wasn't a coach because that team had a lot of talent. Shamori Pons, he had brief moments with the NBA, Mustafa Heron, LJ Figueroa. Like, that team was good. Like, that team had players. And they were ranked at one point. They weren't ranked at the end of the year, but they were, I believe, at some point in that season. They had a big game against Villanova at MSG where they came back and won. They ended up making the play-in. And then if you watch that play-in game versus Arizona State wasn't even that great. I believe they lost in the first round too, in the round of 64. You watch that game, and it was just so clear that St. John's was so poorly coached. A lot of bad shots, no rhythm offensively, and it became clear, and there were some things under Chris Mullin's name, things that were probably going around, the behavior of the basketball team, and Chris Mullin resigned, and he left. So when that happened, a lot of people were like, yeah, it needed to go. It didn't work. He wasn't a good coach. He just wasn't a coach in general. Mike Anderson comes in. He has a winning record every year. Now, we heard that. St. John's fans heard that, and they're like, yeah, he made the tournament. I believe he made the tournament a few times in Arkansas. He also didn't in several moments, but he always had a winning record. It's like, okay, that's nice. But what you understand is that in college basketball, winning record isn't enough, right? So, and that's what you learned at St. John's. He comes in his first 2 years. It becomes clear what this team's identity is going to be. They can't shoot a lick, but they're going to play hard and play defense and score in transition and press the hell out of people. Until you actually, when the game slows down, you have to, you actually need shooters out on the floor. You need to space the floor. You need to get more of an offense going. And that's what Mike Anderson's teams lacked. Shooting and closing out games, because closing out games, you need to have a half-court offense. And I believe Mike Anderson probably did the best with the talent he had to offer. But the overall summary I concluded with Mike Anderson's tenure here is he just didn't get enough shooting on the floor. He had some scorers, Julian Champagnie, who's now with the San Antonio Spurs. He's showing some signs, of being a solid player. He had talent. Posh Alexander was a talented dude, right? I believe he won Big East Freshman of the Year his freshman year. So they have guys, right? They had talent, but it ultimately wasn't a good mix of talent. And you think you saw that this year specifically and last year, because I believe St. John's signed an extension for Mike Anderson. They extended him, which, by the way, there's some drama with that too. But it just seemed after they gave him that extension, things just fell apart completely. He lost control of his players. A lot of players were suspended this year, including the transfer Curbelo, who has game but clearly did not click with Mike Anderson. We'll see where he ends up. Highly doubt he comes back. As Rick Pitino said, most of the team is not coming back. But with Mike Anderson, it seemed he had lost these guys, and with the amount of suspensions, some people seem to have liked him, but it just seemed in the last 2 years he just lost it, because this team had talent to go further and they never did. It just seemed like a collective group of guys that didn't really mesh together. And as soon as the game slowed down, you saw them blow leads. They would always compete with these big teams, but they lose. I forget what his record was in Big East play, but it wasn't very good. He would always be in games with the Villanova, in games with the Marquette. You saw that recently with Marquette, in games with the Xavier, and they'd lose at the end. So mainly because of their lack of half-court offense. So that was the issue with Mike Anderson, and we'll get into quickly the issues with Mike Anderson too. It just seemed like the players he had, St. John says he didn't stress, the importance of education and behavior for the players. A lot of their, There was a report recently that Pitino looked at I believe the character reports of some of the players, and they said it wasn't great, minus 2 people. That's what he said. Soriano is going to be back. There was a quote recently that said Soriano would leave if Mike Anderson left, but I guess the only way to fix that is if Rick Pitino comes in, and he's your head coach. So Soriano, great that he's coming back. Awesome player. He's a nice big, right? So it just seems like he's the type of guy that St. John's can have in there and really build a program, even though he'll only be there next year. But Rick Pitino has named him captain. He already recruited him from day one. He was the only St. John's player from last year's roster that was at his press conference at MSG, which is so cool. The press conference was at MSG. But, so what Rick Pitino is going to bring to this St. John's team is shooting, more of a traditional half-court offense. It's going to bring players in that can do that. It's going to be up and down, fast pace, and it's going to be a very entertaining product of basketball that you just did not see in the past few years. Mike Anderson's teams, they played hard. There are times they were fun to root for. But man, they really couldn't shoot. They struggled to shoot severely. And Mike Anderson, obviously didn't stress the importance of that. He liked the other parts of the game, but when it came down to shooting the basketball, they just struggled so much. And Rick Pitino's going to completely change that. So, even some players that are, even some fans that are excited, about St. John's basketball, maybe weren't in love with Mike Anderson's product. Rick Pitino is going to change that significantly. It's going to be a very entertaining level of basketball. So, why is Rick Pitino even coaching St. John's? It's because of his scandals. So, obviously, just to go into the things with Rick Pitino, he coached at Boston College at 24 years old. He was an assistant under Jim Boeheim. He was an assistant under Hugh B. Brown with the Knicks. He said he learned the most being an assistant with the Knicks. He went to Providence, completely changed that team, right? Went to the Final Four with that squad. Was the Knicks coach. They went to the second round. They lost to Jordan's Bulls, but I believe they swept Barkley's Sixers in the first round. And then he goes to Kentucky, has great success with Kentucky, wins a national championship over there, right? Goes to Boston and has easily his biggest failure of his career. Definitely mostly as the general manager. He would get players, trade them, was full of it, all that. Just not a good choice to have him be the president, front office, GM at all. But he had success in the NBA as specifically a coach with the Knicks. So, Boston, maybe if he was just the coach, maybe it would have been different. But as a GM, he was a disaster. And as soon as he quit, they started seeing some success. They made the conference finals, I believe, a year later with his assistant. I'm forgetting his assistant's name, but with Paul Pierce and Antoine Walker. Antoine Walker couldn't stand him in Boston once he had money and didn't have to listen to Rick Pitino's jawing. But Pitino goes to Louisville, has great success, wins a national championship in 2013. They're in the Final Four the year before. They lose to Kentucky with Calipari coaching that Anthony Davis team. So this was, a good stretch for, he makes the Hall of Fame. I believe 9 years ago, right? He makes the Hall of Fame. And then all of a sudden, their tournament banner is stripped because of these scandals of the new recruits getting strippers and prostitutes sent to their room. It's his assistant coaches. He claims to have no knowledge of it. There was also a player, I'm forgetting his name, who was, I believe, offered $100,000 through Adidas, who was representing Louisville at the time. Also, apparently Rick Pitino had no idea about. He had no idea that they were paying players. Judging off what Pitino has said and that he's completely gone backwards on his word many times, I'm going to assume he definitely had some knowledge there, even though NCAA, doesn't think that. I mean, I don't think it's he's come out and said he wrote a book. I didn't read the book, so I'm not going to say that, but I've heard people read that book and they said he said absolutely nothing in that book to really clarify anything about his scandals. But I'm not going to throw him under the bus too much because college coaches have, shady stuff all the time. But that's the reason St. John's had the opportunity to sign him, because they were both desperate. St. John's was desperate. Rick Pitino, in a way, was desperate. Even though he saw some success in Iona, there was no way he wanted to coach in Iona for the rest of his career. Nothing against Iona. It's just the odds of them being a tournament team were just not. I mean, not a tournament team. They obviously were in the tournament. The odds of them being in the Final Four, NCAA championship level, was pretty low. And now at St. John's, you got a bigger market. They play in Manhattan. The campus is in Queens. It's New York City, right? Iona's New York, but St. John's is New York City. It has the name, right? Bigger players have played there. Chris Mullin, Mark Jackson, Ron Artest, now Metta World Peace, right? So they have had this brand before of Lou Carnesecca, one of the greatest college coaches ever, right? They have a brand. And Rick Pitino coming in there, a guy who coached against Lou Carnesecca, oddly enough, Lou Carnesecca, still fighting strong, 98 years old in that press conference. It says a lot that he was there, right? In Pitino's, at Pitino's introduction. So he's going to have great success there. And what I expect the team to look like in the near future and long term is I expect this team to make the tournament next year, if not the year after. But I expect them to be there next year, even though the Big East is loaded, right? You got some great coaches. Cooley obviously going to Georgetown. Patrick Ewing not being there should add a couple wins in itself. But Danny Hurley, right? UConn has a real shot to win the tournament this year, right? Villanova is a big program, right? Villanova had a struggling year last year, but you always expect Villanova to be in the mix, right? Marquette, always going to be in the mix. Xavier with Sean Miller, going to be in the mix. If I'm forgetting somebody, I'm sorry. But like St. John's having Rick Pitino and is definitely going to help them, even with the loaded Big East. This is one of the greatest coaches of all time that we're talking about here. So as good as those other coaches are, they don't have the resume that a Rick Pitino has. Now, Rick Pitino is older. He's 70, but as you hear him say many times, he's an example of like 70 is the new 40 at this point. The dude just has so much energy and passion for basketball. He said constantly he was going to quit after his time in Louisville. He's like, I will never be coaching basketball again. Didn't last very long. He's coaching in Greece. He's going to Iona. He's now at St. John's. He said Iona is going to be the last school I coach at because he didn't think anybody was going to hire him again, really. That was bigger. St. John's is desperate. They get him in there. That's the story, right? I believe St. John's will be his last stop. I do, because of his age and I think the market in general. I don't know if he's going to get a better job than the St. John's, especially because Georgetown gets Cooley, right? Some people argue that job was more enticing than St. John's. But the idea of bringing St. John's back into tournament play and playing at Madison Square Garden, I just don't see Pitino leaving after that. Like, he signed a 6-year contract. We'll see if he wants to coach after 76. I still believe it'll be here. And it's going to be rocking at the Garden if St. John's is putting top-tier tournament-level play, right? I'd be shocked if they're not in the tournament and like twice, in the next few years. He will be there, and he will have great success, in my opinion. Obviously, you could say I'm a little biased, but Pitino has gone everywhere, and he has won. Everywhere. The only time he hadn't is with Boston. And in Boston, he was the general manager. In the NBA is a different story. But even with the Knicks, he was winning. So I think and this obviously isn't the pros. It's college basketball. So he actually can yell at these kids, and they're not going to turn away from him. So the future and the long term, next year I expect them to be in the tournament, but I actually do expect them to contend in tournament play in probably 3 years. I would say that. 3 years, I think you can expect them to contend in tournament level play. Mainly because with Pitino teams, his recruiting style, he gets guys who have raw talent and can be developed. It's what he's always done, right? Maybe every once in a while he can get a really excellent player, such as Donovan Mitchell. But even Donovan Mitchell wasn't, coming into the draft even. I believe he was the 14th pick in the draft, maybe 13th. But Donovan Mitchell was not seen as one of the top-tier guys coming out of college. So it just seems to be Pitino's style of recruiting, getting guys who are hungry and wanting to develop and just love basketball. So he did say 6 to 10, possibly 6 to 10 new players can be added to this team, which is basically the entire roster. So I expect Soriano to be back, maybe one other dude, but most of the players I do not expect to be back on the team. We'll see by next week. Some people have already entered the transfer portal, but it's going to be a brand new roster. So that's basically all that's needed to be said about Rick Pitino. It's a home run hire for the Johnnies and the Big East. Big East, for a while, wasn't even relevant. But now, they are. They have top-tier coaches in that conference. If you look at the tournament right now, Big East teams are all over the place. The Big East is back big time. And maybe it's not the 80s, as you hear some older people say. Yeah, it's not like it was in the 80s with Patrick Ewing and Pearl Washington and Jim Boeheim at Syracuse and Mullen. And it may not be that, right? But it's still really good. I just think college basketball isn't as popular now as it was in the mid-80s at that point. But I think you're going to see an elevated level of play in the Big East for a few years now. Like, we got a nice, timeline, I think, ahead of us to see some really excellent play in the Big East. And it's going to make the campus a lot more money. Talking about St. John specifically, it's going to make the campus a lot more money if the team is winning and it's an attractive place to go to. Then all of a sudden, more students are going to want to go there. I love St. John's. I think it's a beautiful campus. I love the people there. I love everything about my experience at St. John's. So it's not me just promoting it. I loved it so much. I could not see myself going to another school. If this team is winning and giving the program that much attention, more people are going to want to go there. And it's only going to make the campus more money. Home run hire by President Father Shanley. Rick Pitino is part of the Red Storm family. He's going to bring some greatness to MSG, in my opinion, in a few years. Maybe not, maybe he may not get to a Final Four or a national championship, but he will make St. John's relevant in a way that they haven't in 20 plus years, basically since the Ron Artest era. So I'm excited for it. Thank you for listening to this episode of the JB Podcast. Next episode, we're going to talk about some other stuff, you'll see, but mainly probably NBA and some movie talk. But I had to get this episode out here. Rick Pitino is the new head coach for St. John's. That's my school. This is how we do it. So thank you for listening to the JB Podcast. I'll see you guys next time.